Two engines, two wars. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, liquid-cooled, narrow, 1,500 horsepower, powering the Spitfire over England at altitudes that demanded everything it had. The Pratt & Whitney R2-800, air-cooled, radial, the same horsepower in a different architecture, powering the Hellcat over the Pacific. Same conflict, opposite doctrine. The Army Air Corps chose one, the Navy chose the other. Both were winning their wars. In 1944, a Republic Aviation test aircraft running an air-cooled engine hit 504 miles per hour, faster than any production P-51D. The procurement decision that followed was not based on that number. By the end of this, you'll know why the question of which engine was better, air-cooled or liquid-cooled, was never answered, and why the jet engine made sure it never would be. Most people assume the Radial won. Post-war aircraft ran on them. The verdict seemed obvious. There was no verdict. The two architectures were winning different wars in different theaters for different reasons, and the competition was ended from outside before either side established what the evidence actually showed. By the end of this, you'll understand what kept the argument alive, and the moment it was ended before it could resolve. The engineering difference between liquid-cooled and air-cooled is physical before it is anything else. A liquid-cooled engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the Allison V1710, runs coolant through passages around the cylinders, transfers heat through a radiator, and presents a narrow frontal area to the airflow. That narrow profile reduces aerodynamic drag at high speed and allows the engine to sit deep in a slim fuselage, the propeller shaft extending forward through a clean nose. The power density achievable in that narrow package was the argument for liquid-cooled in a high-speed fighter. More power per unit of frontal area, higher top speed for the same airframe. An air-cooled radial presents the opposite trade. The cylinders arrange around a central crankcase, exposed directly to the airflow, cooled by air passing over their fins. The frontal area is larger, the drag is higher. But there is no coolant system, no radiator, no coolant lines, no pump, no fluid that can be lost. The engine is mechanically self-contained in a way the liquid-cooled architecture is not. That self-containment had a specific operational value the drag penalty could not erase in every context the war was about to create. The Navy understood the full consequence of that difference before the war made it testable. A Navy procurement officer making the air-cooled case in the early 1940s didn't argue thermodynamics. The arithmetic was simpler. One bullet through a coolant line drained the system in minutes, the engine seized, the aircraft went down, and over open water that sequence had one outcome. A radial absorbing the same hit kept flying. It might lose a cylinder. It might run rough. It would still fly. The difference wasn't performance in ideal conditions. It was what happened when the performance was interrupted 500 miles from the nearest airfield. The Navy's pre-war commitment to air-cooled was institutional doctrine built on that specific operational truth, not conservatism, not manufacturing inertia. The Army Air Corps reached a different conclusion from the same engineering evidence. The fighter doctrine of the 1930s prioritized speed and altitude, the assumptions about aerial combat that the Spanish Civil War and the early European campaigns appeared to confirm. Liquid-cooled delivered the narrow frontal area and power density those priorities demanded. The Merlin and the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire performed at the altitudes the Battle of Britain required. The P-51D Mustang, with a Merlin under the cowling, became the definitive long-range escort fighter in Europe, the aircraft that could follow B-17 Fortresses to Berlin and return with enough fuel to fight the whole way. The European theater validated liquid-cooled not as a preference, but as a demonstrated operational result against a specific enemy, in a specific airspace, with an established logistics infrastructure beneath every airfield the USAAF used. Two services. Opposite conclusions. Both correct for the war, each was fighting. The split wasn't institutional stubbornness. It was two different answers to two genuinely different versions of the same question, derived from two genuinely different operational realities. Over England at altitude, chasing German bombers with a logistics chain beneath every base, the Merlin's narrow profile and high-altitude power delivery were the argument. Over the Pacific, hours from the nearest forward base with no guaranteed glycol resupply and no established maintenance infrastructure, the R-2800's self-contained architecture was the argument. Two services had reached opposite conclusions from the same engineering evidence. Both were about to be proved right. The Pacific theater was asking questions the European theater had never needed to answer, and the engine built to answer them had been quietly closing the gap liquid-cooled had owned since 1940. The Pacific theater's operational demands were not a variation on the European problem, they were a different problem. The distances were longer, the forward bases fewer, the maintenance infrastructure thinner, and the logistics chain that had made the Army's liquid-cooled doctrine function invisibly in England, the glycol coolant resupply, the radiator repair capability, the trained ground crews who had spent 2 years learning the Merlin's specific requirements, did not exist at the forward island bases the Navy was operating from in 1943 and 1944. The argument for air-cooled that the Navy had built in the pre-war years on operational theory was now being validated in operational practice, at scale, under combat conditions that tested every assumption both services had made. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered combat in 1943, powered by the Pratt & Whitney R-2800, an 18-cylinder air-cooled Radial producing 2,000 horsepower in its combat rating. The Vought F-4U Corsair ran the same engine in a different airframe. Neither aircraft had been built to the performance specifications liquid-cooled Doctrine had set as the target. Both aircraft exceeded those specifications in the combat environment they actually operated in. The Hellcat's kill ratio against Japanese opposition ran above 19-1 by the end of the war. The Corsair's performance record over the Pacific was comparable. The R-2800 was not matching the Merlin on a dyno sheet in a test cell. It was outperforming the pre-war assumptions about what an air-cooled fighter could do in the theater that had been built for it, against the opposition it was designed to defeat. While the Navy's air-cooled doctrine was being confirmed in the Pacific, Wright Aeronautical was running a development program that was changing the terms of the engineering argument. The R-3350, duplex Cyclone, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9, air-cooled with a fuel injection and cooling system refined through years of development, was pushing into power figures the pre-war Radial had never approached. Late-war variants were producing 2,500 horsepower in military rating. The power density gap that had defined liquid-cooled's core advantage since the 1930s, more power per unit of frontal area, the number that justified the drag penalty of the cooling system and the vulnerability of the coolant lines, was narrowing, not closed, narrowing. The engineering distance between the two architectures at the end of 1944 was measurably smaller than it had been at the beginning of 1942, and the direction of travel was visible to anyone reading the dyno sheets. Republic Aviation made the distance visible in a single test flight. The XP-47J was a development variant of the P-47 Thunderbolt, modified for maximum speed, lightened airframe, a bubble canopy, a carefully cowled Pratt & Whitney R-2800 pushing 2,800 horsepower with a war emergency rating. In August 1944, the XP-47J reached 504 miles per hour in level flight. No production piston fighter in the world was faster. The P-51D, the aircraft the Army Air Corps had built its liquid-cooled escort doctrine around, had a maximum speed of 437 miles per hour. The XP-47J was not a marginal improvement on an air-cooled design. It was the fastest piston aircraft the war had produced at that point, running an air-cooled engine. The procurement decision that followed was not based on that number. The Army's liquid-cooled supply chain was established in Europe. The parts, the trained mechanics, the coolant stocks, the radiator repair infrastructure, all of it already in place, already functioning, already sustaining a fighter force that was winning its war. Introducing an air-cooled fighter into that supply chain mid-campaign solved an engineering argument at the cost of a logistics disruption nobody was willing to accept. The XP-47J's speed record went into the test reports. The P-51D production contracts continued. Neither service had reason to revisit a doctrine that was winning its war. The institutional positions that had formed before the fighting started had been confirmed by the fighting in their respective theaters, and the confirmation made revision look unnecessary. The engineering argument was closer to resolved than either service had acknowledged. Then something arrived that made resolution irrelevant. The XP-47J's speed record existed in a world that was already changing. In the summer of 1944, the Gloucester Meteor entered RAF service over England. The Messerschmitt Me 262 entered Luftwaffe service over Germany. Both were jet-powered. The Meteor's top speed in early variants was 415 miles per hour, slower than the XP-47J's 504. The Me 262 reached 559 miles per hour. Neither figure captures what the jet engine actually introduced, because the relevant number was not top speed. It was the performance envelope the jet made available without a piston engine's mechanical complexity, cooling vulnerability, or torque signature. The question both piston programs had been competing to answer had assumed that piston engines would define the performance ceiling indefinitely. That assumption expired in 1944. The procurement response was not immediate. Production contracts for the P-51D and the F-4U Corsair continued through the end of the war. The aircraft already in service needed the engines already in production, and mid-war procurement transitions carried costs no wartime planner was going to accept. Post-war planning conversations running alongside the final year of fighting made the direction clear. Both piston programs were competing for a role the jet engine was going to occupy. The Army Air Corps and the Navy were reaching the same conclusion from different directions at the same moment. The architecture competition that had organized a decade of procurement decisions was becoming a question about whether piston fighters had a viable future at all. The Merlin's post-war life was narrow. The de Havilland Hornet, a twin Merlin long-range fighter entering service in 1945, was the last serious military application. Racing aircraft carried the Merlin into the 1950s, the unlimited class at Reno, running modified variants beyond any wartime specification. The Allison Vi 1710 found a second life in turboprop derivatives, the engineering embedded in liquid-cooled cylinder and valve work, informing early turbine development in ways not always publicly acknowledged. The liquid-cooled architecture did not disappear. It narrowed into the applications where its specific characteristics still had a context. The Radial's post-war life was broader. The R-3350 and R-4360 continued powering large piston aircraft into the 1950s and beyond. Agricultural aviation, aerial firefighting tankers still running R-3350 engines in the western United States, B-29 Superfortress variants in the final years of strategic piston bomber operations. The torque characteristics and mechanical reliability that had made the Radial the Navy's carrier choice made it the logical selection for any application requiring sustained low-altitude power without the logistics infrastructure a liquid-cooled system demanded. The architecture outlasted the competition that had defined it by decades and is still outlasting it. The question of which was better was never established, not because the engineering was unresolved. By late 1944, the R-3350's power figures and the XP-47J's speed record had made the gap smaller than either service's institutional position acknowledged, but the conditions that would have produced a verdict, a single theater, a single logistical environment, a post-war piston competition sustained long enough for geography and supply chain to stop determining the result, never existed. The jet engine removed the question before those conditions could be constructed. The question of which engine was better was never answered, not because the engineering was unresolved, but because the competition was ended from outside before the conditions that would have produced a verdict ever existed in the same place at the same time. What the air-cooled versus liquid-cooled story demonstrates is that engineering competitions don't produce verdicts on their own. Operational contexts do. When the operational context changes faster than the competition can resolve itself, the question doesn't get answered. It gets replaced by a different question that neither side had been competing to answer. The Merlin and the R-2800 were both right. They were right in different theaters for different operational reasons against different logistical realities, and the war kept changing which of those realities mattered before either side could write the answer down. The engines outlasted the argument. That is not a resolution. It is the specific shape of what remains when a competition ends before it produces the evidence either side would have had to accept. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. There are more of them.